Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and today I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Peter Salisbury, who, among many hats that he wears, is a fellow at the Century International. Peter, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
So I know you just put your kids to bed. It's about 9:30 on Monday night, May 11th, and I wanted to talk to you of all the different people in my life today because I wanted to sort through in real time how to think about America's apparent and to me obvious loss in this war that it started with Iran and to start sorting through something I know you've been thinking about for years and years, which is what does a world look like in which relations are not defined by American primacy, in which US power is not the sole or even primary factor determining what happens around the globe, and in which trends that you have really pioneered are my thinking about, which, global trade flows, financial flows, the kind of nuts and bolts of a multipolar world order that you argue has existed for quite a long time, actually, and now seems to be surfacing into view. So that I woke up this morning, I was reading Robert Kagan's story that to me sort of said a bunch of obvious things, but seemed very exciting to people to say, "Oh my God, if Robert Kagan thinks America lost the war, it must really have lost the war." And I immediately thought, what would Peter say about this moment and this future that's finally arrived?
Sure. So you and I have been talking about this for a number of years now, and you've actually kind of over the years batted me into this position where I say we're not in a place of true multipolarity yet, but we're in this messy transition where the nature of power, what power buys you, is in really deep flux. And the United States is unquestionably the world's global superpower, economically, militarily, so on and so forth. But that just doesn't buy you what it might have once upon a time. And it's easier today for state and non-state actors to increase the economic and political costs, the military costs of war through relatively cheap technology that can be sourced from all over the globe, that the US has less and less of an ability to interrupt in ways that can push the US into a standstill. And I mean, as you know, I'm best known, if I'm known at all, as a Yemen watcher. And in many ways, we got a bit of a sneak preview of exactly what's happening right now in Yemen over the years, where the Houthis were firing these designed, increasingly Houthi assembled drones and missiles that are used to target Saudi Arabia and the UAE and forced the Saudis into a position where they thought, "Do you know what, we're just going to have to do a deal with these guys, despite being way more powerful on paper." And then last year, the US decided they were going to bomb the Houthis into submission to stop them hitting ships in the Red Sea and Israel with drones and missiles. And what happened? The US ended up doing a deal, a truce, a sort of no-cost truce with the Houthis. And these
I
aren't
mean,
new
I mean, there
things,
was a
right?
cost to the United States, right? The United States thought it
Sure.
could make the Houthis back down, and in fact, the United States backed down and said, "Pretty please, don't attack our ships, and we will stop bombing you." And the Houthis said, "Okay, but we reserve the right to continue striking Israel and maybe other
Yeah.
people's ships too."
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the US still did powerful country things. It still killed a bunch of Houthi leaders, it damaged a bunch of infrastructure. They came out of it hurting, but they were able to impose asymmetrical costs and not the old-fashioned Vietnam War asymmetrical costs where you put boots on the ground and then you pay the costs. But this new form of asymmetrical costs where a state can or a non-state actor can fire missiles, fire drones over a long distance and hurt you where you are, not just where they are. And in many ways, the American intervention in Iran, the American Israeli bombing of Iran, seems to have been based on this idea that as long as we don't invade and we just bomb them, that's low cost to us. And obviously, the Washington Post and now the New York Times have had a series of articles, but particularly over the last couple of days, where they've used satellite imagery to show just how many US military bases and installations have been hit with Iranian missiles and drones. And that really is changing kind of the game, the nature of power as is expressed militarily.
So maybe we should organize this conversation, or at least the beginning of it, in two stages. Maybe we can start by talking about America's loss, apparent loss in this war, and then we can broaden out because the really one of the really interesting things about the way you approach this is it is not American centered, right? I mean, you're looking at the process of modern warfare, the process of modern power. We're often focused on something the U.S. is doing or some conflict the U.S. has provoked or gotten involved in, but in fact, this model that you're seeking to understand is it's an international reality that the U.S. is just one of many sort of cast
Right.
members in. So if you agree with that approach, let's start with the loss. Um, which I think of course it's early to assess, but I think it's late enough in the game that we can say that the U.S. started a war with a bunch of clearly stated goals. It achieved none of them. It
Mm,
lost not just a huge amount of prestige, but a huge amount of hard power. I mean, the discourse in the U.S. is often literally uses the metaphor of a playground and bullies and reputation, and acts as if there aren't any sort of material setbacks that this great power can suffer. And in fact, it seems like the U.S. has suffered like an amazing uh, actual literal military setback at the hands of these relatively cheap boats and drones. So how do you sort of score this elective war and the outcome to date for the U.S. And then we can move on to how that reverberates into the emergingly clear architecture of the international system.
sure. So, to use a really terrible sports metaphor,
I hope I
essentially,
can understand it because I don't speak sports very
you do
well.
love the sports. Uh, Essentially, the US has kind of decided it's going to have a boxing match with Iran. And it's the undisputed heavyweight champ of the world, or it thinks it is. And it thinks that really Iran is, a 150-pound weakling, whatever you wanna call it. Uh, and all Iran has had to do to humiliate the US in this context is stay on its feet and land a few punches for enough rounds, which is what it's done. Iran hasn't had to win, and I find this kind of win-loss framing a little bit tricky because I think it misses the point of what is happening. The difference between this and a boxing match, though, is that Iran has been fighting for its life. It's fighting an existential war, but it's done it on the cheap. And the US has expended an astonishing amount of money at a time when this administration and other kind of Western populist governments love to harp on about how much money is wasted on government. So they need more than in the past, perhaps, to win this war in order to justify that expense, to justify the cost of gas at the pump, because this thing's gone wrong and it's increased fuel prices internationally, so on and so forth. So not only have they not won, they don't have a neat narrative coming out of this, and people are actually watching the cost of the thing in the way that maybe they weren't directly in the same way in the early way years of, say, sort of the US invasion of Iraq, although there were, of course, people doing that, and you were around for that particular episode.
So the I mean, I go back and forth on this because, at least as far back as the sort of early 9/11 wars, we meaning like the reality-based community, we were often in we were often having these arguments with American triumphalists where they were saying like, we kicked these guys' ass, we whooped these bad guys, and like really talking like dumb Wild West movie characters. And we would say like, you fail to understand how politics and power work in a place like Iraq or Lebanon or Syria or, later on Yemen, Libya, so on. And that, these groups you're trying to eradicate can't be eradicated. They're still standing, they're still part of society. For them, survival is a form of victory. And you just said a minute ago, like the victory defeat sort of binary is not helpful. And I basically agree with you, although I actually find it notable in this current war that actually on a sort of traditional hard power, like old-fashioned military analyst rubric, the US has lost. I mean so I think that is worth noting because like when we talk about say Hezbollah versus Israel 2006 or
Mm,
Yemen, the Houthis versus their adversaries, those are cases where one side is really suffering all the losses, and
mm.
then they might survive politically and couch that as a defeat. In this current war, Iran has actually destroyed American aircraft, killed American personnel, wounded hundreds of Americans, made bases inoperative, has, as you were just saying, changed the global economy and showed that it cannot be forced to open the Strait of Hormuz. And that's not just a sort of mismatch of like, well, they're surviving while the other side is winning on all the other metrics. They're actually winning on the main metric that Trump himself cares about and that the Pentagon cares about, which is forcing its way on its adversary.
I mean, Iran has suffered a lot of losses, but yeah, I think, the classic social science definition of power is getting someone to do something that they otherwise would not. And what you see in this conflict is the US came in and said, we've got all this surplus power that we're not using. And if we just use it enough and in the right way, then people will do what we want them to do. And in this case, either the Iranian regime will melt into the floor or it will succumb to our maximalist demands on its nuclear program, on its axis of resistance network, so on and so forth. And Iran utilized asymmetric power and forced the US into a position where it's doing some things that it otherwise would not do. And I suppose what's been fascinating about it is watching the TikTok of Donald Trump's thinking in real time, where there have been moments where he seemed to imply that maybe, the Iranians should be allowed to set up kind of a toll for ships passing through the Straits of Hormuz. So I think that you can argue that, yeah, if this is an exercise of power, setting aside ideas of winning or losing, but using this frame, Iran has been able to get the US to at least contemplate doing things it would otherwise not do, whereas the US, if anything, for the time being, has entrenched within the Iranian regime um, a stubbornness, much like my daughter's refusal to go to bed earlier this evening, that appears to be sort of even harder to overcome.
So one of the factors that we haven't talked about a lot in the sort of short-term analysis of the war because we're focused on the regional fronts is the way that China's role as a bulwark of the global economy, Russia's war as reportedly a source of targeting information for Iran, have revealed that decades of resentment at American overreach and abuse of power have created a world in which relatively reasonable actors like China and maximalist actors like Russia, which has always been, I think, happy to have direct or near direct confrontations with the US in the last 20, 30 years, have been able to cooperate against the US and its partners. Because I think without that piece, right, if it was just Iran with no help or and no diplomatic pressure and no economic support and so on from these other powerful states, this war wouldn't have unfolded. I think it's fair to say the way it has. And I know it's again early to start looking at what the real contours of a world in which countries are not afraid to challenge the U.S. directly or not afraid of U.S. military might. I mean, it's and I just want to underscore, you said a minute ago, and I think it's really important to note, like, yes, the death toll on the other side of this war is huge, right? The U.S. has, I think, killed something like 3,000, at least, maybe far more Iranians, while suffering maybe 13 documented deaths on the American side. It's wounded 25,000 to far more than that Iranians and has had only 400 wounded on its side. So I don't mean to suggest that there isn't a profound and distressing asymmetry to the human harm. But it bears noting that after decades of seeing the US and Israel primarily, and maybe some of their others, the UAE and Sudan or others sort of take this approach that if you kill enough people, you can have your way. We're finding you can kill a lot of people and you still can't have your way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the the point on Russia and China is important, but the work we've been doing and will publish with Century later this year maybe points to something just as interesting, which is we're really kind of 2 decades, a little more than 2 decades into the US making sanctions and economic warfare one of the primary instruments of its foreign policy. If you do things that we don't like, then we're going to sort of sanction you. Will declare this group a foreign terrorist organization, and will try to make it difficult or even impossible for you to function within the global economy. And what we're seeing, and I think there will be more commentary on this in the coming months and years, with this particular war, is Iran being able to buy high resolution Chinese satellite data using dollars, but also sort of Chinese currency, cryptocurrency, so on and so forth. Both Russia and China, sorry, Russia and Iran being able to buy a lot of different components, raw materials, etc., from China at incredible volume that allows them both to run their conventional and asymmetrical warfare campaigns, and the US kind of slapping an absolute ton of sanctions on both states, and that's slowing the process down a bit, but not really ending it. And I think that a lot of people still have it in their mind that, yeah, sanctions work sometimes and don't work sometimes, but I think the scale at which Iran and Russia have been able to evade sanctions to build up their current arsenals and then reconstitute them on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis is something that people will start talking about pretty soon. And China is absolutely central to that. And it's in this interesting position where Chinese companies are somewhat sensitive to American sanctions in that they will just sort of set up a new version of the company the next day if they're sanctioned, and it does make banking more difficult. But at one and the same time, China can simply have an export-oriented economy and not track too hard where a lot of this stuff is going and allow these countries to cause the United States a considerable amount of trouble while kind of road testing current American military capabilities directly and indirectly, which is very useful to a country whose entire military planning is based on sort of a single contingency, which is the potential of a war with the United States over Taiwan.
So you've raised a lot of points that I want to ask you to expand on, and maybe let's start with the overuse of sanctions. So have we reached a tipping point where sanctions and I include in sanctions the sort of lower grade like denial of access, debanking, I
Mm.
guess, and other ways in which this U.S. controlled financial world is has historically been so necessary to everybody that even without the threat of literal sanctions, other governments and companies, private corporations will do what the US wants in order to not lose access to these financial platforms. And I've been hearing for I think my entire adult life from resentful governments, other economic actors who say like, if this pressure continues, we are going to build alternate, alternate currency baskets, alternate banking systems. We won't leave ourselves forever vulnerable to the whims of the U.S. Treasury. Has that actually started to finally come to maturation and happen?
I don't think we're all the way there yet. The US is still sort of the primary player in the global economy. If you want the best technology, if you want the best software, the best banking access to the best kind of financial instruments, you still want to be playing playing with the United States. But if you're already a sanctioned actor, then that stuff's not available to you. And then you can look for like the second tier stuff that you can get via various different channels. And the number of channels that are open to you, different types of financial instruments, different ways of trading, different ways of obscuring your cargo are increasing and becoming increasingly lower cost. So it's not a question of back in the day, Iran had its own shipping fleet and it would use those ships to bring a lot of stuff internationally to Iran, and it would do all sorts of things with changing the manifest and manipulating trade documentation to give the impression it was doing something else. Well, now it can just kind of ship stuff to somewhere in Central Asia via shell companies, somewhere in the Middle East, UAE, Turkey, even, and then move it via a variety of different companies all the way to Iran pretty quickly and just rebuild that whole system as and when the US sanctions a company. So just the number of channels that at a lower cost available to a country like Iran have increased exponentially. And I mean, one of the fascinating things again about the current conflict has been the Iranians charging ship owners to move their ships through the Strait of Hormuz,
Wasn't it something
and
like a
use
billion or $2 billion per ship that they were charging at some point?
it wasn't a billion, or I think it was sort of 2 to 3 million per
Ah,
ship,
okay.
which
Chump
is
change.
slightly less. So yeah, chump change, absolutely. But doing this either in Chinese currency via the Chinese banking system or doing it in cryptocurrency, but among other things, using a cryptocurrency called Tether. And the entire point of Tether is that one Tether is worth $1, is that it's a stable coin. So it is de facto an instrument that is the same as dollars, but can be stuck in a crypto wallet here, there, anywhere in the world, and transferred into dollars. And in Asia, you can now go to a store and transfer your tether to that store and be given physical US dollars in cash. And I
So
don't
it's
know,
dollars that are outside of the control of the U.S. Treasury, essentially.
correct. Yeah. So you've got this giant world of financial instruments that the Treasury can kind of try and crack down on. But increasingly just are operating at, again, incredible scale, incredible volume, lower and lower cost, and are just more and more accessible. So we're moving in a direction where sanctions will never be totally ineffective. Lots of people always want to trade with the US and will take the trade-off of not being able to trade with certain other people. But if you're in that kind of tier of actor who's been sanctioned or reckons they're going to be sanctioned anyway, there's a world of people who are willing to do business with you to make a profit.
Well, and the U.S. has gone really to the max on its sanctions against Iran over a long period of time, and I think its sanctions against Russia have been, if not the maximum it can do, have been quite close. And then
Right.
against China, it's used not sanctions but tariffs. Somehow, all this punitive activity has completely failed to stop the global economy that it was meant, the part of the global economy that it was meant to threaten and shut down.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering is, I mean, I don't know if you can get precise with a sort of estimate, but the goal of US policymakers after 9/11 was to make close to the entirety of the global economy, or at least the licit global economy, be reachable by US policy instruments, right? I think that that was the
Hmm.
goal of formalizing previously informal financial platforms so that they could then be subject to American coercion. And obviously, there's a I shouldn't paint this only as a terrible thing.
Mm.
One of the good goals of this was to reduce the reach of criminal networks and money launderers and violent extremists and so on. Anyhow, that experiment clearly has reached its apogee and is in retrenchment now. And I wonder if you have a sense of like what percent of the world economy at its peak was reachable by U.S. power, and how much less is reachable now. And I mean, maybe that's a fool's errand to ask in those terms, but it's what I'm curious
Yeah.
about because I think the pretense was, American power. If you're willing to bust norms, America can
Mm.
control these things. And not only was that not true, but whatever it was able to control at its peak, it can't.
Right. So there are these guys, Abraham Newman and Henry Farrell, who wrote this paper, Weaponized Interdependence, and then wrote a really great book off the back of it. They don't give you percentages, but they make the point that around 2001, 2002, so 9/11, its aftermath, the US kind of realizes that the global current economy runs on dollars and dollar transactions have to clear essentially via US banks or banks that have to work with the US. And that the internet, still at that point, the plumbing of the internet runs through the United States. And that's true for many things in the global economy. So you can't put a percentage on it, but it was just the ultimate dominant pole. There was just no alternate that you could go to if you wanted to move money internationally. If you touched a dollar at any time, then you were really scared of American sanctions. And today, um, China is not this sort of global center of capital, which is what a lot of American policymakers like to think about and talk about, right? It's not a country where there are just sort of trillions of dollars lying on the table that people can pump into AI. That has to kind of happen via the state. But what it is the world's major exporter of goods, intermediate goods, things that sort of are used to make other things, and therefore the world's major importer of raw materials. And what those things represent in both directions are value. You have enormous amounts of value going in and out of the country, and that can be used as a stand-in for money. We think of it sort of as hawala, maybe where you use kind of goods as a stand-in, but this is just sort of an astonishing scale. And it means that sort of a larger and larger part of the world, the thing that matters to them most is the ability to sell things and to buy things from China rather than the US. The US is a much less important exporter than it was in those days. The internet is completely decentralized. And thanks to cryptocurrency, thanks to the rise of other currencies, and because of this sort of mass global trade in goods that didn't function in this way 25 years ago, all that kind of network hub power that the US had has dissipated. And again, still the biggest, still the most important, but sort of little by little dissipating into not just kind of one other country, but just this mesh, this web that is the global economy.
So one of the cases that I think I don't remember if you identified it or if you were just the one who told me about it, is these complex swaps where a container full of oil that's being smuggled on one end can be traded for drone parts and other non-military exports from China, and maybe
Right.
three or four or five intermediaries are trading this along the way, and ultimately that oil is shipped from Iran to
Hmm.
India or some port somewhere and sold, and
Hmm.
these goods are shipped from China, and somehow the like without ever touching a formal dollar or a traceable financial instrument, uh, uh, parties as far afield as merchants in East Africa, militants in Yemen, middlemen in India, and merchants in China are all doing business, and they're doing this in a way that is completely off the books, I guess,
Mm.
or in the gray
Well,
economy. Is that
on,
right?
I mean, not entirely in the grey economy, and that's what's so fascinating about it. So you're thinking about this work that we did around this guy called Saeed al-Jamal, who the US Treasury love to sanction on a regular basis. He's a Yemeni guy, the son of Gap farmers from northern Yemen, so sort of one of the great sort of success stories of the globalized world, who starts out smuggling Iranian dodgy, not very good fuel into the Horn of Africa, and then at some point transitions to running giant tankers full of oil from Iran, often doing these ship-to-ship transfers off the coast of the UAE or Malaysia, and running them into China. And he gets sanctioned, the tankers get sanctioned, the refiners who are buying his or the Iranian oil get sanctioned, the banks doing business with them get sanctioned, and you think job done. They can't really do anything. But in fact, what happens is very interesting. So he takes his sanctioned tanker, he fills it up with sanctioned oil, he moves it via sort of ports that will accept it to China. He sticks the oil into the sanctioned Chinese refinery, who pay him in local currency in renminbi to the local bank. And then what he can do, if he so wishes, is have someone withdraw that in cash. He can convert it to cryptocurrency. He can do a variety of things. And he does a bunch of different stuff with it. He uses it as crypto just to sort of underwrite international business, money transfers. But something that he also appears to do is that he provides trade finance to Yemeni and other Middle Eastern businessmen in China. So they get the money, maybe in physical cash, to go and buy goods that they want to export to not just Yemen, but sort of Saudi Arabia, Turkey,
And these goods
Lebanon,
could be
as you
like
say,
light bulbs, like
Africa.
normal
Yeah,
stuff.
for sure. One of the stories we were told was that sort of one of these guys buys IKEA-like furniture, fills it with vape pens, sends it to Saudi Arabia, makes a double profit, but then they repay the principal plus interest to an account not in China, but in the second country, so in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, and then that account belongs to a business attached to someone who has no visible connection to Syed al-Jamal. That person can use that money to do legitimate transactions, or they can use it to, for example, help run money for Hezbollah and for the Houthis, which also happens. And it
So it's a
creates
sort
these
of
pools of money. Yeah.
unbeatable money laundering, essentially. Yeah.
I mean,
If you
it's never completely unbeatable, and a lot of these guys do get sanctioned eventually. But what it does is sort of set up like a little mini banking system. The money exchangers, for example, can tap into, and you end up with this ecosystem that's not 100% illicit. It's doing a lot of normal business and making money from it, but the underlying capital comes from this sanctioned trade, which forces it into these areas. And it also means that this guy ends up with quite large amounts of money in multiple different countries. So instead of just pushing him out of the legitimate business world, again, because of this volume of trade, this demand for goods from China, he can set up these parallel financial instruments and trade instruments where he ends up with his dollars in various different countries, but it's much harder to spot who holds it and where.
So I'm talking to Peter Salisbury. I'm Thanasi Cambanis, and you're listening to Order from Ashes. And we're talking about what the contours of a post-American dominance world looks like through the prism of this self-inflicted defeat in the American-Israeli war on Iran, and a lot of the implications of Peter's long-term research that looks at the kind of uh, uh, cloudy, hard, sort of hard to map, but ultimately clear to understand once you know how it works. Kind of non-US reachable trade networks that have emerged in the world over the last couple of decades. And I guess, Peter, I want to ask you uh, how how you read what this looks like for people, right? Because I mean, a lot of what we talk about is at the grand strategy level. The U.S. Sort of being cut back down to size, a world in which many powers more evenly matched, do this and that, and that's I think very important and interesting. But you've spent a lot of your life also looking at what it's like to be on the receiving end of this kind of, like to be a regular person in a place like Yemen or Iraq or,
Mm,
one of these global hinterlands that is often on the receiving end of people's crazy theories about global power and reckless experiments, I guess, with grand strategy. So, how does this kind of post-American hegemony world look for vulnerable people in I guess, growing swath of the world that is going to be in, I guess what we call the global South, but really is going to be everywhere, the sort of the global, the vulnerable part of the globe.
right. And this comes back to sort of a conversation about defeat versus not defeat, right? When you look at what has happened in Iran, the US has not been able to impose the kind of costs and pain on the Iranian regime to change its behavior. At one and the same time, the Iranian people who have paid the price for a terrible regime are the people who are fundamentally paying and going to pay the price for this. And the reality is that these military campaigns, these sanctions policies are arguably increasingly ineffective versus entrenched, crappy regimes that have worked out how to tap in to these global systems and networks and how to utilize them and how to work with other crappy regimes and non-state actors. And the people who really pay the price, literally and figuratively, with their lives, with the cost of living, with the economic opportunities that they do not have, are just ordinary people living their lives or trying to live their lives. I do think that we sometimes I hear folks from across different American administrations talking about how they're going to reshape the Middle East. And I have one person in mind who was on TV recently and talked about actually this is an opportunity to reshape the Middle East, which is a line he's been using for 20 something odd years. And I think that the Middle East has been reshaped in a way where, and people make this argument about Israel a lot of the moment, and it's certainly not untrue, but where powerful states are increasingly able to sow chaos and make life almost unbearable for ordinary people in a way that mitigates threats against them and makes their life marginally better and doesn't cost them that much. And I wonder if we're moving into a place where that's even more normalized than in the past, and that the shock of the past few years has been not to valorize it, that some of the sort of not very pleasant states and non-state actors who are on the receiving end of this has started being able to bite back. And that's neither a good nor a bad thing, but it is a reminder to us that kind of in some ways we're tiptoeing towards accepting a policy environment in which large swaths of the world live not just in poverty, but in permanent militarized chaos.
I think that's a fear that has arrived in a large way, and I think I mean there are Americans and people in the global North who maybe over-index how supposedly good or at least predictable the U.S. dominated order was. And I think for people living in the sort of safe zone, for those of us who grew up in Northern Europe or in the United States,
Hmm.
Canada, some other G7 countries during the post-World War II American century, for those people, it probably was a good deal, right?
Mm.
Things were relatively predictable. There was little to no war within those areas. There was a lot of prosperity over time. So, one way of looking at it is that the downside of security bargains is being democratized, right? So more costs will be borne by the dominant players, and my fear is more, I think, like what you were saying, which is just that things will become generally less predictable and less secure for a greater number of people.
Yeah.
So it's not that we'll see some gain for the Yemens and Sudans and Ethiopias of this world from a fallen America. We'll just see some of the terrible dues that have been imposed on weaker states will now also be borne by stronger states. And in a moral calculus, one can say like the perpetrators should experience the harm, but it's certainly not a source of satisfaction for me to think like, oh well, they did it to
Right.
everyone else, now it's going to be done to them too. I would rather it be done to fewer people, period.
Yeah. I think there's an argument to be made here that we're now seeing, multiple states wake up to the idea that, oh, we can get in on this action. And maybe the best case study of that is somewhere like Sudan, where you're just seeing mass death imposed through direct and indirect remote warfare with multiple regional powers, middle powers, great powers, kind of getting stuck in here, there, and everywhere, and treating the world as if it were a game of risk in which you don't care about casualties, human suffering, and you're looking to make marginal gains on this kind of chessboard, to mix my metaphors, but trying to make these marginal gains so your power is increased here versus adversaries one, two, three. And I do worry that, yeah, that's the direction we're traveling in, and where people increasingly accept that this is just kind of a cost that's imposed on some countries, and that remote warfare kind of reminds us from time to time that it doesn't always work out for you. But many of these actors, for the time being, aren't going to be able to target American military bases across the Middle East. That still requires a state actor like Iran.
So maybe this is the last question. You have helped us understand a new reality in which motivated actors who have some smart people who are willing to put in the time and receive the training can become somehow, if not strategic matches for like traditional great powers like the United States, can become like the Houthis have using drones and a sort of complex mix of human capital and newly available cheap materials out of which you can fashion a fiberglass drone and then hit a ship. Uh, does this, I mean, is this what the whole world will look like in short order? Like in any part of the world, any determined actor, whether it's a militia in the United States that doesn't like what the government's doing, whether it's neo-Nazis in France or freedom fighters in Sri Lanka or you name it, will be able to assemble one-way drones that can actually like swarm and hit a real sophisticated military target. And if so, how how does how does strategy and security, how do we attain stability and security in a world in which proliferation of this kind of power is
Mm.
genuinely accessible, like democratically accessible to all kinds of rogues and journeymen?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question that's staring my little team and I in the face right now. And I'm not an arms expert. I work with a bunch of arms experts, and generally, people who work on drones in particular are surprised that a non-state armed actor, a state, just some lunatic, is yet to work out how to build a big enough drone and put enough explosives in it to make something go bang in a European or American capital. And that's coming. That is something that is going to happen. And what's um, interesting, somewhat ironic, I guess, is learning that uh, the global drone economy is a Chinese economy. China produces most of the drones, most of the components that go into the vast majority of drones sold and used all over the world, from a little kid's quadcopter to what the Iranians and Russians are using to wreak havoc on civilian infrastructure. And the Chinese government is massively cracking down on the possession and use of commercially available drones, particularly around cities. And I think that's
In
really
China.
telling.
So
In
they're
China, of course,
they're
yeah.
allowing their distribution worldwide, but
Yep.
they're battening down the hatches inside their own.
To buy a drone, you've got to have ID. You probably have to have it chipped. If you want to use it, you have to get on an app and ask for permission from the local police, so on and so forth. So they're beginning to really monitor this very, very closely for very obvious reasons, but also reasons of espionage. And it feels like we and the rest of the world are just kind of half asleep on this problem. And the reality is that to begin to address this democratization of long range strategic weapons, you have no choice but multilateral action. It's not enough, coming back to the conversation we're having at the beginning. You can't be the biggest, toughest guy in the schoolyard and just swing your fists at this particular problem. You need collective action to think about how to deal with not just the drones the Iranians are using, but relatively unsophisticated people or actors getting hold of multiple drones and using AI to launch drone swarms, which is just going to become easier and easier in the next kind of 5 or so years, not 5 or 10. And that's when we're all in serious trouble. But we're in this moment where there is paralysis in the international system and coordinated multilateral action. And maybe this is going to be the thing that makes us wake up. But otherwise, I think we're in for, some really nasty things happening, not just in poor places in the global south, but here in the United States or in Europe or other rich countries.
Yeah, I mean, history shows us that powerful states are willing to surrender some of their power and share sovereignty only after a very long and very painful experience of finding that the alternative is worse for them. And so I think the post World War II period, in so much as it involved some positive developments, was the result
Hmm.
of, for Europe, 100 years of constant warfare finally teaching Europeans that collaboration, boring collaboration, is better than violent competition. For the US, I think it was always a little bit more of a theoretical proposition because they, with the exception of the 1941 Japanese attacks, didn't really,
Hmm.
suffer war on their own territory. So,
Although your
uh,
country's democracy and internal setup is basically designed to prevent civil war among American states, because you're such a large contribution of people. So yeah, the United
yeah,
States
although
learned. They
it's,
just learned in the mid 19th century.
and I don't think that system, even that piece of it, is working so well these days. Um,
Doesn't look like it.
Peter, thank you so much for coming on late on a Monday night to talk through these questions. I think you are an invaluable guide to thinking long term about what the world is going to look like now that I think we can kind of settle the argument about, is America the sole dominant hyperpower? It is not. I don't think that's any longer debatable. So, what does power and adjudication of disputes look like in this new world? So thanks for helping us think through this. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International. I've been talking to Peter Salisbury. Peter, thanks for coming on Order from Ashes.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll be with you here again next week. Thanks. Thanks for listening.